It's the same disembodied American voice asking, telling us about recording every time, huh?
Yeah, it's the same one. So first, at the very beginning, I want to thank everyone for accepting our invitation to join the GAPS Reading Club. This is the first of 3 meetings that we plan for this year, and each of the meetings have a broader theme, but they will be focused around the book that will provide a starting point for discussion. For this first session, we decided to focus on introducing the posts, when the post-socialism meets post-colonialism. And we thought that actually the excellent book that can provide that starting point is the book edited by Crawford.
Not unmute my audio. Not unmute my audio.
Beyond State Crisis, Post-Colonial Ethic and Post-Soviet Eurasia in Comparative Perspective. So what is the intention actually is we want to try actually to, within the discussion happening within the reading club, to develop a framework and to see if it's possible to develop a framework for placing post-socialist and post-colonial space into comparison. What is the value of that framework and what that comparison actually can achieve? Can it help both of the spaces somehow to overcome that eternal periphery position they're unfortunately occupying? I think that Crawford Young and Beissinger in this very ambitious book and very ambitious project provide a very good introduction into that, even though my impression is that the framework laid out in the book that they use has certain limits. So, depending on the approach, the regions they are including, the conclusions, the issues. So what I would actually like us to do is to discuss some of the limits of this book and to try to propose the elements, the key elements of the new framework. So for example, when they talk about the post-socialist and post-colonial space, for me, it wasn't convincing enough why they limited themselves on the post-Soviet Eurasia. For example, they are identifying the imperial subordination as the key element that is common to both spaces. But even if we take that as a fact, why then they don't include the rest of Eastern Europe, for example, or the Balkans, who was also subjected to imperial, it was part of imperial subordination over a long period of time. So this approach that they apply had certain shortcomings. What is missing also, in my opinion, is that international dimension. They don't flesh out in a proper way, or critically, to say it like that. Because when they speak about and they write about transition during the 90s and the experience of post-Soviet countries and post-colonial Africa, the piece that is missing, and that I think is the crucial for understanding the nature and the pace and the outcomes and the huge costs of that transition, is precisely that international dimension. And they don't, somehow attention is not on that. So that is the broad agenda that I would like us to discuss. But before we start, I would just, because some of us know each other, but I'm not sure that everyone knows everyone. So I would just like to introduce the members of this reading club. So with us is Ivor Chipkin. He is the director of the Government and Public Policy think tank. We have Professor Radmila Nakarada from University of Belgrade, Professor Paul Stubbs from Institute of Economics from Zagreb, and Professor Firoz Khan from University of Stellenbosch.
Greetings, everybody. There's Mr. Khan. There you are. Can you Can you hear us, Khan? Oh,
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
just if I can just add another word, Yelena, thank you very much for arranging this and for those opening comments. I think there's something very tangible and important about the very idea of this project, and I think this is why the book is a useful one, even though we will discuss its limits. I think what it does very well, though, is that it puts on the agenda, if not for the first time, certainly in an original way, the very basis of a comparison between the post-Soviet and the post-socialist and post-colonial. And I think that question is absolutely key. Both theoretically, it's of great interest, but I think increasingly politically, and from my point of view, from a policy perspective, it's becoming increasingly important. In the South African context, we have just come through or going through what we term in South Africa a long phase of what's been called state capture. Essentially, the imbrication of political networks linked to the lead ruling political party into key elements of the state, and which have then repurposed and looted elements of the state either for their private personal benefit, but largely to generate revenue for internal political battles. What is so important, though, is that the concept of state capture comes from, of course, it has a longer provenance within Marxist scholarship more generally, but more immediately, its provenance arises from more recent World Bank scholarship on the transition in the Soviet Union. So again, this idea of state capture is a phenomenon that arises in the post-socialist environment and is situated in relationship to that history. The way it unfolds in South Africa, although we've never thought theoretically in terms of that relationship, but it does beg the question or raise the question of South Africa in relationship to those socialist transitions, and whether there is something about those transitions which render or make valuable a point of comparison. So I think the very project is an exciting one. I think it's theoretically challenging. I think politically it's potentially very important, but I do think there are very, very substantial methodological risks and dangers in this project, which I think which is the purpose really to start engaging with. I mean, so there's the question of state capture. I mean, I'm also finding in some of my work that the deep imbrication of criminality across from former socialist countries and post-colonial and post-colonial networks. So there are a whole range of current political features of our politics, which I think are intimately related. When I was last in Belgrade, or the time before, there were a whole lot of assassinations in Belgrade related to criminal Serbian organized crime activities in Johannesburg. Recently, there was an assassination of a policeman, and it looks almost certain that the munitions provided for the assassination and even the assassins themselves were commissioned in Bosnia. So there are these complex networks and stories between these countries, which I think raise very interesting methodological and conceptual questions on the basis of a comparison. And this hopefully is what we're what we're going to do here. So again, Yelena, thank you very much for this initiative. And I'm going to now step back.
Should I start? I mean, it's great to be part of this. Thank you for inviting me. It was a long book, and thank God that Achille Mbembe and Stavrakis rescued for me what was a deeply problematic book. So let me just say one positive thing and one negative thing to start with, because I think we can come back to state capture and so on and so forth. But for me, the positive thing, and you've already said it, Yelena, is this attempt to do what I would actually call post-comparative scholarship, because it's not, a lot of comparative scholarship kind of compares countries with one another. This was trying to compare regions with one another based on notions of a kind of post-imperial kind of legacy, right? And I think that actually has much more potential than we actually got in the book, because there was not a great deal of comparison done in the book. People were either scholars of the post-Soviet space or the African, or parts of the African space. But still, it's a good idea. But the flaw, and I mean, it really is the editors this extraordinary commitment to liberal democratic political theory, right? And that plays itself out in two ways in the book, right? One is the idea that the state, and they sometimes call it the Westphalian state, and they sometimes call it the Weberian state, the idea that the state, which is both incredibly new as an actor in political formations and incredibly confined to one part of the globe, it's as if the state is the most important actor. So I think, Yelena, your point about, transnational dimensions, international financial institutions is just one part of this extraordinary state-centric approach. But the bit that's even more worrying, of course, is this idea that there's something pathological. They even use the word syndrome. Now we have some crazy sociologists in Croatia who talk about egalitarian syndromes. So a use of a medical pathological model to describe political processes in Africa and in the post-Soviet space. So you end up with this kind of labeling of domestic political elites as problematic. And what's missing, of course, then, is a study of global political economies, of colonialism and capitalism. We had to wait until page 258 for the word neoliberal, all right? And apart from the chapter by Stavrakis, it's actually only mentioned once. So you've got this extraordinary combination of a liberal, democratic, normative statist approach combined with a failure to address, the economic destruction of neoliberalism at the time. Achille Mbebe's chapter, I love his work anyway, as it has evolved over time. And the problem with Achille, of course, is you always want to talk to him about the thing that he's just moved on from, because he's such an active kind of scholar in a sense. But Achille Mbebe manages within the first 5 pages to completely destroy the liberal democratic orthodoxy of the introduction, because he says, we can't think about boundaries only in terms of state and non-state. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more I could say, but I do think that as someone who does try to do work on local state capture, trying to do that in a way that gets away from this being a kind of pathology and trying to understand it as a logical concept of peripheral capitalism seems to me to be something that's very difficult to do. Now, there's been a lot of work since this book on the post-socialist and the post-colonial, but that in a sense is not the point here. For me, the point is statism and liberal democratic theory. I'll stop there. I'm very glad that you made us read it.
Thank you, Paul.
Very nice.
I jump in for a moment. I think first responding to the last Paul Stubbs. We must understand where the book is written. It's written by part of the sponsors with the Woodrow Wilson Institute. And the book is framed in a particular way, and looking at the Weberian state and looking at the kind of formations of the state, etc., and the Westphalian states, etc. But I think also what it's challenging us to look beyond those categories in one sense. And if I look at the book, the last page says it will resolve the essential question is resolve the capacity of public institutions to rule effectively, to create security within the orbit of sovereignty, to generate legitimacy, secure revenue, etc., etc. This is what this book is trying to do. Now, there's a couple of things. On the one hand, when they analyze states, they talk about sins, and then they talk about syndromes. So they cast the blanket quite wide. Then the other thing is that you find conflicting notions. First, the state capture, then there's failed states, then there's sins and syndromes, and then it comes to cohere around a thing which they call stateness. Now, then the stateness is a lot of it is kind of, as Stubbs says, post-comparative scholarship. But I think that the strength of the book lies more in what was happening in South Africa at the moment. I just might reflect on what was happening in South Africa for a moment. During the 90s, there was this democratic movement to change economic policy, blah, blah, blah. But there was also a very conservative group who was pushing the development bank, etc. And there was two kind of narratives that emerged. The first narrative was the Huntington advised the apartheid reformers for a blitzkrieg. In other words, insulate, do it quickly, cut and paste, paste it, it's a cut and chop job. There's not going to be any negotiation about this. At the same time, the guys who were writing Gear were reading literature on shock therapy and the insulated executive. And if you read Stephen Gelb, he says this was neoliberalism and insulated executive and cutting out civil society at its extreme.
Yeah.
And for me, the value of this book then lies on the one hand realizing its limitations, that it is a particular kind of statements that they're talking about, recognizing also that there's a problem with that. I mean, where they take it to is quite another story. But I think the bigger issue for me is how the kind of reform process unfolded in particular ways, which speaks directly to Paul's stub point, which that shock therapy meant a particular kind of political regime, a particular kind of economic regime, which I think absolutely, I agree with Paul's stubs. I mean, that only on 258 do I see the word neoliberal. I'm wondering, what am I reading about before that? I mean, states and war and all kinds of funding. But I think that, so I think that there's one hand, there's kind of ambiguity in this book, which I think offers different planks. On the one hand, how it was implemented, who was screwed and who was done in the beginning, and on the other hand, what kind of was the agenda of that. And I think that the project, sorry, I missed the first part of this, my mic went off, and plus they're doing construction in my house, so I'm sitting in the garden. But what is interesting for me is that I missed the first part, but if the post-colonial project, or if the project that we're talking about is a post-comparative scholarship, I think it should be around the kind of transition, the nature of that transition, the process at least, and what it was called, and then the composition of it and how it shaped the state. So I think that this book provides the resources to work backwards in a sense. So let me stop there, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. So I guess it's my turn. Enjoy it. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to take part in this conversation, and I'm very encouraged that right from the beginning we seem to be sharing a lot of common thoughts concerning the book. It is a big book, and there's lots of material and lots of empirical data that could be the subject of a long conversation. But at the same time, I had a feeling of lingering good old prejudices that sort of draw the line between the Byzantine Russia, Soviet Union, the sort of inferior civilization that whose character actually determined the transition itself, and the past is actually already the programmed present. And there I find determinism that, among else, includes quite, shall I say, a non-critical approach to the sort of Western project. There are a few observations here and there, and some parallels as well, but they're just glanced over. So we have almost a closed combination. The post-Soviet space is the way it is because it was a pre-Soviet space, and so what is there to talk about? Absolutely, if there were choices, we have the elites and the society incapable of making choices. So we're constantly, I think, pushed against the wall. And I think that's a relatively elegant way of eliminating the co-authors of the transition, as Jelena has already mentioned, and Paul. The character of the global framework, and as Stephen Cohen has beautifully described the hordes of missionaries that jumped at Russia in the late 90s with their miracle formulas, which were actually shock therapy, promoting oligarchy and corruption and their own pockets. And then when they pulled out, there was a total breakdown in the society and disappointment and disillusion. The health services broke down, the life expectancy went down, education was disrupted. And I think that that was a moment when there was really a choice for perhaps rethinking in terms of social democracy, rethinking how to filter the socialist heritage in a more constructive way, instead of just turning around and attempting to jump into this neoliberal formula. And I think that to a large extent then is an unfair analysis and comparison. And on the other hand, there is no almost mention of the dynamics of communism. It seems like it's totalitarianism from point A to point the end. That there were variations, there were different circumstances, there were movements within the society on the one hand, and there's also absolutely no nuanced analysis of the colonial system itself of Russia. And I came across an interesting book by Alexander Etkin that I just read a bit of. I'm interested in continuing, about internal colonialism, about a specific brand of colonialism that again has something to do with the relationship between the European and the Russian civilization and the way they perceived each other as antagonistic civilizations in constituting their own identities, and how that has affected the dynamics of the colonialization process itself, at least in Russia. So I would also like to emphasize that this regional comparison looks very seductive and attractive and like a step in a new direction. But I think the word periphery is sort of comparison of various peripheries in the world would be maybe more rewarding, and then they could include on the basis of another criteria areas like the Balkans, but not only that. And at the same time, in addition to mentioning the missing global framework and the co-authors of the transition in both spaces, the character of the global framework, I think, needs to be problematized from the standpoint of the, first of all, neoliberal formula, but also new locations of power, the increase of non-transparency, the problem of democracy in this kind of a global domination, and the creation of new alliances in this digital world of media and intelligence institutions and the academia and the state. So the book is inspiring in the sense that I think it sort of pushes us to reformulate some of the questions they attempted to raise, maybe from a different standpoint, and then come back with some possibly interesting results of our own.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice.
I agree with all the comments that were made about the book, and I was becoming even more inspired by after listening to them. What was for me very unsettling is also how very casually they completely equalize European colonialism with Soviet communism. Don't try to put any shades within each other, or to be critical to, as Radmila mentioned, to European colonialism in more detail. This is a relatively old book, I think. It has been published more than 15 years ago. What would be interesting to do, I would be interested to hearing your thoughts about 15 years after, where is the African state and where is where are the post-Soviet states? And for example, in the case of post-Soviet states, what was the role, yet again, of another international actor? What was the role of the European Union in their transition, in their further developments?
So if I can come in here, which I think both think in relationship to the book, but also think beyond the book. I think, and it's come up in some of the comments, directly and indirectly. I think what is peculiar about around the set of posts, as it's being called, is the role. I think the comments around the stateness and the presuppositions around certain kinds of state forms are absolutely correct. And of course, what that raises is a question of sovereignty, which is taken for granted. Achille Mbembe goes some way to destabilize the notion of sovereignty, but in other work, he resurrects it almost as a universal. So I think his own work is quite ambivalent around this notion of sovereignty and its historical and contingent character as opposed to its universal character. And I think that's not resolved in his work, and it's definitely not resolved in this work, where a measure of sovereignty is essentially both the measure of the state, but also its defining character. So as critical as we can be around that conception of the state and of stateness in relationship to sovereignty, I do think it raises some very interesting questions around the notion of the public and the particular character of post-colonial and post-socialist forms, not necessarily as states, but as political communities. What kinds of political communities are there? To the extent that sovereignty was that they pursued sovereignty, I'm untroubled by the idea that communist parties in the Soviet Union and elsewhere pursued a model of stateness around the conception of sovereignty, drawing on well, Hannah Arendt talks after the French Revolution, the kind of the shift from the sovereign being the monarch to the people, those within the rubric of sovereignty. I'm untroubled by that. So I think there's a lot to, from that point of view, there's a lot of points of comparison between the communist project and the post-socialist project, in that both of them are projects driven to realize some form of kind of popular sovereignty in the post-colonial and the communist form. And I think the post-colonial is also, again, it has a complex relationship to thinking around a post-state form in that particular way. I mean, what I find fascinating about the post-colonial is just how deeply entrenched the notion of popular sovereignty remains. So even though there's a movement away from a conception of colonial sovereignty, as Achille Mbembe has called it, we're still very much preoccupied with the idea that the people should govern and should be sovereign in a territorial state. So we remain very much affixed to those fairly traditional conceptions of sovereignty. So I do think there's some interesting work to be done around histories of sovereignty, conceptually, but also politically, how they've played themselves out in these two zones. But it does then raise a broader question around what kinds of political communities are there? If they're not simply sovereign and therefore states, what really are they? And I think this idea, a way of capturing it, is through this conception of a public. The emergence of what kinds of publics have emerged in the post-socialist and post-colonial environments. Methodologically, I think there's a very interesting starting point for a comparison. What I think is interesting about the post-Soviet, post-socialist and post-colonial, which is different to say from South America, and is certainly different from Western Europe, and India, for example, and other large parts of Asia, is that the extraordinary dominance of national liberation movements and of communist parties in defining the limits of what Rosa Vallon would have called the political. That the political is, in many senses, is coincident with the ruling party, with the Communist Party, or with the National Liberation Movement. So what you have in the post-socialist environment and the post-colonial is the disintegration of the centrality of the Communist Party or the National Liberation Movement. But to what extent is it replaced with? And then what kind of other kinds of publics therefore emerge? What kind of public therefore emerges in the face of the disintegration of the Communist Party as the center of the political, or of the National Liberation Movement as the center of the political? I think South Africa offers a very interesting prism to ask those questions, because we're in the midst of that process. We have a political ostensibly defined by the constitutional framework, but in reality, the rules of the political game in South Africa are defined and determined in and through the ANC's own internal machinations. As the ANC disintegrates, what kind of public is emerging in South Africa? And I think it's a way of opening up and exploring broader comparative questions, which I think would be very interesting. And of course, ultimately, it goes back to the question which Paul, you raised, and Feroz raised, and Radmila raised again. It's this character of stateness. Is there a sovereign? It's certainly not the people. I mean, partly because the decentralization, the fragmentation of the very idea of the public suggests a multiplicity of the sites of authority and power, and which begs the question of what kinds of political formations are emerging in the space of the former Soviet Union, in the space of former Yugoslavia, and in large parts of Africa and in South Africa. I think those are very interesting questions, by the way.
I think that's fascinating, and I think, as a footnote not to be lost, in that first round we actually formulated two very different research questions that go beyond the book. One was a kind of comparative study of reform, right? And the other was a comparative study of peripheralization. And I think that's so much better than the way they do it, right? But I want to, so I'm not an Africanist, and my readings of Africa are through the last 5 years working on the non-aligned movement. But within the book, there is this extraordinary denial of the emancipatory moment of post-colonialism, right? And I think that does two things, because the book that I'm obsessed with at the moment is Adam Getachev's book on kind of Africanist thinking, and her argument that this notion that very quickly post-colonial projects were about state sovereignty. She argues that they were about both state sovereignty and transnational political sovereignty. And of course, negritude in the French-speaking part of Africa and Pan-Africanism in the English-speaking part of Africa were different transnational projects, but they were definitely transnational projects, right? I mean, so this notion that it all went wrong because the Organization of African Unity accepts the principle of a nation state seems to me to be the most absurd denial of this emancipatory moment of post-colonialism. They're also incredibly kind to the Portuguese in a sense. I mean, when one's reading about the non-aligned movement, the fact that, you know, Portuguese colonial violence was still going on in the 1970s is something that I think we really need to kind of consider here. Radmila and I could certainly talk a lot about the kind of emancipatory nature of the Yugoslav project and how it went wrong and the complicated ways that it went wrong, but there's no denying its emancipatory and domestically emancipatory nature, right? And Radmila, you're so right. This notion that the Russian Empire needs an autocrat because it's always had an autocrat, right, is such a kind of perverse kind of path dependency, you know, which seems to me to be so worrying. So to end with, Ivor, I think your point about political subjectivity, political emancipation, in forms that might go beyond kind of nation state notions of sovereignty is actually why a lot of us are going back to look at Bandung, the non-aligned movement, Pan-Africanism and so on, right? Because for all the contradictions, there was an attempt to do something with that. I'll stop there.
Yeah, exciting.
Thank you, Paul. I think Feroz.
Yeah, just very quickly, Ivo, there's a recent piece by Mbembe, and he speaks about the publics, and he says that about the post-colonial affects the identity of the individual. It's fragmented. This is particularly, germane to the discussion of post-apartheid. He explains where there's not a single public, but multiple publics. And this creates a different kind of dynamic for engaging post-colonialism. But I also want to suggest some stubs that I think we should also include a different understanding of neo-patrimonialism. I think it's bandied around and it's being used in very kind of obscene ways. And I'll be sending an article by Mukandiwere on this matter. And I think the last part is that there's an interesting piece recently on that South Africa could be heading down the post-colonial way, but in the sense of with the fragmentation of social structures, the criminalization, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that this is the kind of post-colonial direction, which is the kind of dystopic, which could inform analysis. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah. Just by the way, I mean, I think that imperial framework is absolutely key. I mean, there's fantastic new historical work on the Soviet Union relationship to empire, using a rather unexpected term in my context, at least, is that the affirmative action empire, suggesting that the Leninist conception of the Soviet Union is a kind of anti-empire, redressing the hegemony of Russian dominance by affirming a whole range of other peoples and republics, by addressing, and then there's a turn during the Stalin period. But what I do find interesting is that it's the selectivity around that I think reflects a much wider prejudice in imperial and colonial studies. And that is, as Edward Said referred to it, a privileging of what he calls the overseas empires in relationship to European colonial, the experience of European colonialism. So for example, the fact that it's so difficult to think of the Balkans in relationship to, say, Ottoman Empire, imperialism, outside of very select academic circles, I think is a function of the fact that when we think of empire, when we think of colonialism, our analysis is so exhausted by the work of post-colonial scholars, and the experience of European imperialism in the boundaries of Europe is ignored. And this, I think, provides again a very interesting and destabilizing point of analysis. I mean, it seems to me that I wonder if there's an argument to be made around how the areas of Europe which go in the direction of socialism have these long and complicated imbrication with colonial and imperial histories in ways in which Western Europe doesn't have. So again, I think another very exciting area to be exploring and promising.
No, yes, definitely, because the first impression was why confining their work and their framework to post-Soviet space. Why not including other parts of Eastern Europe who was also under imperial subordination for a long period on time, and also had the similar experiences of transition during the 90s, but they were excluded. And I think that the whole framework would have benefited much more if it would be much more comprehensive and not limited to this geographical regions comparative study.
Yeah, I mean, we should all reread Lenin on imperialism, I think, actually. But isn't it important that, so I think, actually, Jelena, the reason Yugoslavia is not put in is because there would still be that emancipatory moment. So this is a very anti-communist book, right? Or as Dr. Khan said, it comes from the Woodrow Wilson Center. So the editors have this kind of anti-communist thing. And I've just been in the Russian Federation. And yes, of course, the revolution was betrayed in Trotsky's terms very quickly, right? Whereas in Yugoslavia, it was much less so. But there's a total denial of the socialist moment in Africa in the book, right? I mean, all Africa has is empire, is colonialism, and then patrimonialism.
Yes, and also not mentioning the non-aligned movement as such and its achievements. So there is no word of non-aligned movement.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Or even maybe hinting some new ways of collaboration that are like start to emerge within the global South, but including most of African countries. There is no mention of that. So that is why my thinking was that this book and this approach, critically, of course, can be used for developing a new framework, maybe with overcoming all these shortcomings. So I like this, what Paul nicely summarized, these two research questions that different but complementary that emerged out of our first round of comments. So I think what would, in your opinion, would be a way forward? What would be the key elements of that new, more comprehensive, more holistic approach to these two different spaces? And is there any value now in 2021 doing that comparison?
I noticed Radmila is gone. I guess something happened with her internet. Oh, she's back. Excellent.
She's back.
We rephrase it to say it again for Radmila's benefit.
Yeah.
Wait, just wait until she. Okay, so Radmila is back. Radmila, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm sorry. This is beyond my control.
No, it's fine. So we were just talking about what would be the way forward, having in mind that the critical approach to the framework laid out in the book, how to overcome its shortcomings, and how now in 2021 maybe to develop a framework for a comparative work and a comparative study of these two spaces.
Well, I'm not going to attempt to give an answer to that, but I just, if I may, I wanted to make one comment when Paul identified reform and peripherization and emancipation as sort of the axes. I was thinking that actually in contrast to that, what we read basically suggests or implies ruptures and impositions. And I think our job would be to reread in a more differentiated way the experiences of both the post-socialist and post-colonial societies and identify these threads that are at one and at the same time emancipatory gestures within a peripheral framework and that present an attempt to attain one's own formula of development and democracy that resists the simplified historical readings that more or less, again, we encountered in this book.
I mean, I think that's a marvelous way of moving forward. I mean, I would be interested. So Yellen, I'm not quite sure how you're imagining this particular conversation moving forward, but I would hope it would open up into it would. I mean, I think the very idea of some sort of comparative work would be very, very, very exciting. I would be very interested, for example, in exploring, as you know, that missing piece, as Paul put it, you know, that there was the colonial, but there was also the moment of post-colonial socialism, and to think of these global histories of Marxism, global histories of socialism, both as they played themselves out in communist context, but also in post-colonial context, not just as a set of mobilizing political ideas, but also as a set of ideas that informed and structured institutions, structured political spaces, structured economies. And I think that would be a very fertile space. I know amazingly hardly commented on in much of the scholarship, but the role of Yugoslavia, for example, in post-colonial Africa in this regard is enormous. The role of the non-aligned movement, for example, in setting the parameters for the kinds of political solutions which were deemed appropriate from the 1960s and during the 1970s in the post-colonial setting is hugely instructive in this regard. So I would be very happy. I wrote a piece looking at the political characteristics of African states after independence, linking up to the development of international socialism or the non-aligned movement. I would be very happy to look further at that kind of work and potentially present something in this forum as a potential way forward. I mean, it's very kind of starting elementary work, but it might be the basis of a conversation moving forward. So I think there's some very exciting ideas are in circulation.
Yeah, and the topic of our next meeting is non-aligned movement at 60. So,
So that's pretty good.
It's pretty appropriate.
Two things, and one is that in my own work, what I've sometimes done is used concepts that Africanist scholars have used and applied them to the post-Yugoslav space, right? Which is a very risky thing to do, right? Because it can look like auto-Orientalism. But the author that I found most useful in this is Graham Harrison. So Harrison's notion of kind of two things put together, really. One is the kind of flexible sovereignty. I mean, you can use that to look at contemporary Bosnia-Herzegovina really, really well, and the kind of flexible agencyfication that Harrison talks about. But the other thing that Graham's obsessed with, of course, is the developmentalist state. Mm-hmm. And I do think that in the book, not well treated, because they're treated as kind of givens, are these two floating signifiers of developmentalism and modernity, in which all kinds of violences get introduced. But in a way, you know, what are the conceptions of the modernizing process, right? Is there a hegemonic modernity? Are there multiple paths to modernity? What kind of developmentalist processes can be in place? And therefore, of course, you know, you can't leave Latin America out, because Latin America was the testing place for the post-socialist external social engineering, in a sense, right? And so where I'm going with this is that one can borrow concepts from work in one place to another. One can also look at the ways in which different mobilizing concepts have different meanings in different, let's call them conjunctures, yeah, different times and spaces. But I also think, you know, really good readings of history are incredibly important in all of this, actually. And you know, Rad Miller will understand, and you, Jelena, you know, the complete denial of socialist Yugoslavia as relevant to anything, you know, is extraordinary, when actually, you know, self-management, solidarities with the post-colonial space were kind of central elements, at least, you know, discursive.
Third world movement. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You can't imagine third worldism without Yugoslavia. I mean, there's no such thing. A non-Soviet path to communism. I mean, who? Of course. So, of course, Radmila, we're all waiting with bated breath for your book to be translated into English. You have to get a move on there. Radmila has written the decisive book on Yugoslavia, which unfortunately is still not an English translation. So
yes, you're my motivating friend. But I was thinking whether actually there is an emancipatory potential in the way one would do comparative studies between regions, and that could be a different result from this book. That's the intention, to somehow recognize and maybe mobilize at the same time some energies in the way we compare, and who we compare, and how we compare. Yeah.
No, I completely agree.
Gentlemen, I just want to say is that one of the chapters, I think the one in Africa, I mean, the Lewis, he says nothing other than the state that he recognizes other than the developmental state. I mean, that's the first issue. I mean, so he's already there. But the other thing I wanted to say is that if you look at the example of China at this moment in time, there's an incredible combination of state and planning, moving in different kind of different directions, suggesting a new kind of paradigm. And I think the emancipatory potential of what's happening in Latin America at this moment in time, I think there's an emancipatory potential around state formation in the future, and what lessons you could taught from that, from existing project, hooking into the reemergence of the state and planning as being central to modern development. Thanks.
If I can just jump in there, so Feroz will know this very well, but for those who are not in South Africa, you will perhaps not be so surprised, but it is nonetheless striking, is the deep and profound search in South Africa, especially in ANC policy circles, for non-Western models of economic growth and of political integration. Where historically, with the ANC may have looked to the Soviet Union, to the socialist bloc, the influence of China, the model of the Chinese Communist Party, but also of its various schools of public administration and the model of public intellectuals, etc., is enormously influential, even when there is an understanding that the historical contexts are so fundamentally different. And I think what it speaks to is exactly this kind of emancipatory urge to find a model of emancipation which is not Western. And I think there's something about the post-colonial and the post-socialist which speaks to an urge or a wish for a model of emancipation, which both delivers from the West and is also autochthonous, another model of freedom. Yeah, fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, does anyone want to add anything or have additional comments?
Well, I mean, just a footnote, because I mean, non-aligned movement is my obsession these days, but the new international economic order, when I absorbed myself in it, it looked like a very modernist and a very Yugoslav kind of idea, because it was basically rapid industrialization, efficiencies in agriculture, and a level playing field in trade, right? So I'm not surprised, Ivo, that there's now this attempt to think about non-Western kind of economic practices and knowledge in a way, but they would be post-industrial, wouldn't they? In a way, or they'd be kind of, they wouldn't be the industrial. Rad Miller was mentioning the kind of digital world, the industrial revolution 3.0, whatever. They would have to be different from the old models in a sense.
Yes, but that I think it's why for a while, but now much less. There was so many hopes and optimism around BRICS. There were hopes that BRICS will provide that alternative, new model of development that will be non-West.
Feroz, I don't know what you think about this, but I think, Paul, just in relation to what you've just said, what is so surprising about South Africa is the extent to which there is, at one level, a preoccupation with the fourth industrial revolution, whatever that means. But in terms of economic planning in South Africa, there's the instinct towards a model of industrialization, which is very much those of the sort of the large factory producing. It's a kind of 1950s model of industrialization. Powerful trade unions organized in large manufacturing, large manufacturing production units. There's something very much romantic. There's still a deep romanticism and attachment to a kind of a post-war 1950s Dutch model of industrialization, which is both with strong socialist characteristics. I think the model of self-management is there in the background of much of the fantasies of what a transformed post-apartheid South Africa would look like.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two issues here. First of all, there's liberalization of bandwidth, which they haven't done yet, which points to a serious problem in their planning. But you're right. I mean, there's still the anchorage in the minerals energy complex, and a continuation of things in capital, in the high capital intensive stuff, less labor, and also this intensive capital intensification now because they even want to take the unions out of the equation completely. And then there's the countervailing discussion about the sustainable development stuff and moving to clean energy. And now what's happening is that then this transition is that the workers would lose their jobs. So now there's this kind of jostling between say, Greta and Tasha, for example, who might not allow so much independent electricity provision, but the minings will say, don't worry, we want more and we'll set it up on ourselves. And so there's these things in this cabinet. So and the point is that there is no coherent industrial strategy, number one, and number two is that there's no coherent redistribution strategy. So as a result, the part dependency, which Paul was talking about, is stuck. I mean, and this is an interesting thing that I found about this book, is that the ones who were non-transitioned actually did many times better than the other. You know, this is what's interesting I found about this book. So maybe this kind of I said that some of the in the concluding chapter, I think it was some of the non-transition countries did badly on macroeconomic balances, some of them, but actually perform better growth. Part of the reason because may have been the existing economic policy decision circuits were the same, or the economic policy decision circuits were captured in the first instance. And as has happened in South Africa, the economic policy circuit has been captured. So that's why I'm very excited by this, partly because I think that that it points to things in the future and it portends something which can be quite progressive if you kind of spin it the right way. Thanks.
Good. Thank you. So if there is no more comments or replies, so the idea is that this is just the first of our meetings. The next one will be on the non-aligned movement at 60 and a new ways forward when it comes to cooperation within the global south. And the third one is supposed to be on the that internal periphery position that most of the global south occupies. So the whole idea behind the themes and behind the reading group is that this is just the first step in defining that comparative framework. And then as we move forward, it will be much clearer what are the key things that that framework needs to contain and how to actually develop it properly. And I want to thank everyone for reading this big and problematic book and participating in this session.
Yeah, and Yelena, thank you and well done. Congratulations for organizing this. I think it's for a South African, it's very exciting to be part of a conversation which thinks not just beyond South Africa, but also beyond the African limits to new areas of comparison. And so I'm very excited about this project. It would be, I think it would be interesting to give some thought around what happens to this reading group and to the extent to which we open it up to more people. Yeah, fabulous conversation from my point of view. So thank you very much.
Yes, thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Helena. Much appreciated. Great stuff. Thank you.
See you next time.
Ciao.
See you next time.
Ciao.
I did. Vediamo se.
Vediamo se.
Ciao.